Hello and welcome to Health Talk. I am your host, Angela Baracco Eddy. With me tonight is Dr. Roger Orth. He's a board-certified gastroenterologist with Gastroenterology Associates of Pensacola. Tonight's topic is something that's a little bit different, a little bit out of the ordinary, but life right now is a little bit different and out of the ordinary. So tonight we're going to be talking about generic drugs, China, other problems. We'll be getting into all of those things. The show will go many different directions, I have no doubt. So we're very excited that you're joining us tonight. Thank you for being with us. It's an interesting time that we're living in, but we're going to be talking about medical things. We're going to be talking about different things that are going on that affect all of us or that affect some of us, but in some way it really affects all of us. So Dr. Orth, welcome.
Well,
you're prepared.
Well, I am. You know, being 69 and in quarantine, I have to be really prepared to come out here in public like this.
Well, and my husband asked me about it before I came too. He was like, do you have your mask? Are you going to wear it? Do we need to do those things? We made sure that everything was sanitized. We are socially distant from pretty much everybody. We're a little bit closer than we probably should be, but
Yeah.
it's an interesting time that we're living in.
It is, but Barbara gave me this to carry today, which is
I love
keep
it.
calm and carry on. So that's what we're going to do. You know, but to be honest, I can't really wear this the whole time. This is my Norway outfit.
I like it with the
This is my
puffin.
locally grown mask, which was made here in Pensacola.
There you go.
And so I've got my puffin outfit, and I thought I would talk about something that had several levels for me to be inspired, because all of a sudden I found out that everything was made in China. And so since all these things made in China, all of a sudden the economy collapses, and then I thought, well, this really couldn't affect me. But, you know, it turns out it does affect me, and it affects a lot of people. And so I thought I would be narrowed down on a subject that's a little more neutral than things that how this happened or what we do next, because this is very out of my league here. But what isn't out of my league is that I am a gastroenterologist now for 36 years, and I grew up in a situation in which we saw intellectual property, which is coming from different items, including especially things like new therapies, drugs, chemicals. And over the years, I was involved with the people who did the very first tests on this fabulous drug, Tagamet, which was a blockbuster for SKF. And ultimately, it was a blockbuster for Glaxo when they competed and came up with their own iteration, which became Ranitidine. Well, you know, lo and behold, in the fall, I started to get patients telling me, what do I do with my Ranitidine, though? Because 2 million Americans take Ranitidine. 2 million Americans take it. It's a lower price drug than the big high price PPIs. It works for most people, and so they take it. And so Ranitidine had some problems. And so then I thought, well, you know, it's probably just the way they packaged that or something, and they recalled some of it. And this was in the fall. And then one thing leads to another, and it turns out that the Ranitidine was contaminated, and especially if it sat into the heat at all, like it was in your car and you took it only when you had heartburn for this or that. And it had this stuff called N-nitrosodimethylamine. This is NDMA. So this is not something that usually you hear much about, because it's not part of anything that we think about. It used to be added to jet fuel, but we found better things to add to jet fuel. But it does turn out that it's a carcinogen. And so in the fall, these little old ladies would say, but what do I do about my Ranitidine? And I said, well, you can switch over to Pepsid or something. Let's try that. But it came to my attention that this was a potential issue. And it turns out this material, the way it comes from, is actually that the precursor for all the generics, and this is a generic drug now. This is not done by a corporation that had the intellectual property to make it. but this is a problem that was outsourced. And because we want the cheapest possible health care, then we outsource it. And who outsources it to? To the generic makers. So that's really what I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight, because the generic story is the tip of the iceberg for what's wrong right now with our economy.
Let's start from the basics. What's the process that a drug goes through to become a generic? What does that kind of look like?
I want to make sure you understand that when I was a little guy learning things, there weren't any generics.
Right.
There were no generics floating around. And so we had drug reps, and people would buy you a lunch or this or that, and you would end up learning about a new drug that so-and-so had come up with. And over the years, generic drugs weren't really part of the deal. Generic drugs became a part of the deal when they became as an alternate. And so I want to go over some of the reason they became an alternate. We have several different presidents that get involved in this story. It's very interesting because the presidents often play a role in what happens. We're actually seeing that right now, aren't we? But these presidents make a difference because they're trying to do the best they can with what skill set they have. And so let's go back to the Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984. It turns out that the Hatch-Waxman Act brought us generic drugs. And that was from Mr. Reagan, somebody almost anyone could admire at the time. And so Mr. Reagan wanted to have prescription drugs cheaper. And there had already been a law that said that we would have cheaper drugs that once they went off the intellectual property, you should be able to make a generic, the same chemical structure. But because the way the pharmaceutical industry worked, in 1984, there were very few actual generic drugs being sold. They weren't being sold because of evergreening. People would make a way that the intellectual property drug extended its patent, and you ended up having almost never a drug that was a generic, and when it was a generic, it was actually made by the company that designed it in the first place. So in the Hatch-Waxman Act, this set the terms for generics to be made in the United States. And this was an interesting act because it was an effort to bring down the cost of medicines. This is before Medicare Part D. This is when people bought their own medicines. And so when people buy their own medicines, you want to make it cheaper because that's how you get reelected. And so they decided that they would give you this brand new thing called an ANDA, which was an abbreviated new drug application. And this was what starts the whole process of the generic. Now listen to this story, because back in 1984, there were almost no generics being sold in this country. In 2020, which happens to be this year, about 90% of all drugs written as a prescription in this country are a generic drug. They're not from the intellectual pharmaceutical house. 10% of all the prescriptions that do have it.
90%?
86 to 90% of all current drugs in this country are generic. So the story I'm telling you affects lots of things, and it turns out the economy that we're feeling, and why was ranitidine recalled, and ultimately now it's been taken off the market. What happened? Well, it turns out that the pharmaceutical industry has been gradually being offshored. And as it got offshored, so did many other chemical industries. In fact, there's a remarkable number of industries that got sent offshore. And the company that is responsible for the problem with the ranitidine is actually a company that changed the manufacturing process for the ranitidine because the precursor molecules, they found an easier way to do it. This is how generics get cheaper. They found an easier way to do it. But it turns out it's not particularly stable in heat. And so, lo and behold, here we are in 2019, and I have little old ladies telling me they can't take their ranitidine, and then, just about 2 months ago, the FDA finally took it off the market. Well, this is part of my problem, is that this goes way back, but then how does it creep forward? Where did this generic thing start to come in? Well, when the Hatch-Waxman Act came in 1984, that set off what you call a gold rush. Because within the first month, 1,000 applications for intellectual property of a drug were filed, and because of that act, they could end up having accelerated rate of actually being accepted. 1,000 turns out to be quite a few. And at the time, almost all of our drugs were made in the United States of America. And there were some that came from Europe. There were basically none that were coming from overseas. None, not to speak of. But when the Hatch-Waxman Act occurred, then they ended up trying to reward the generic company. And they rewarded it with this little tiptoe that says, hey, you can charge whatever the full-scale company was charging for the first 6 months, and we'll let the first company that designed it, they can extend their warranty for an extra 5 years. Well, the drug companies thought that wasn't going to be too bad because they get a little bit more of their time. And so they end up having these set off for this incredible gold rush of it. So then we end up with this sudden flurry of generics. And we did have some technical breakdowns in the system. Because in the technical breakdowns in the system, we had people who, some of them worked in the United States government, were working to slow down or speed up so-and-so's application, because whoever got there first, they would end up wanting to sit in the parking lot waiting for the day that this is going to come undue so you can be the first to file. And so the first to file turned out to be a big deal, and ultimately there had to be congressional investigations, what was going on that had people who were having people taking the actual prescription drug, running it through their machine to prove that it was biosimilar or bioequivalent. And when they did prove it, then they were running the original drug through, but then when they started to sell their drug, it wasn't the same drug they ran through the machine. Well, that set off, so Representative Dingell, a famous guy that you all might remember him, but he decided that we should straighten this out, so they had the Generic Drug Enforcement Act. That's 1992. That made them so that you would end up having problems that would be less risky, and we also tightened up at the FDA. So we would not have all this kind of thing going on. So back then in 1983, which is really just before the Hatch-Waxman Act, I want to point out that 35% of all top-selling branded drugs had a generic, but only 13% of the prescriptions had anything to do with a generic. That's 13%. And now, 90%, 85% are generic. But they were at least made in America back then. They were at least made in America.
Which is the difference. And I hate to interrupt you, but we're going to have to take a quick break.
Oh.
I know, already. It's time for us to take a quick break. But we'll get back to it. There you go. Now we're protected for our break. We'll be right back. Stick with us. We'll be back with more Health Talk.
Our weight. It's with us every day. It's not that we don't try to say goodbye to our excess weight. We do. We exercise, we eat healthier, we try to stay active. But for many of us, it's simply not enough. Well, there's finally a solution. Introducing Orbera, a non-surgical procedure to achieve meaningful long-term weight loss. Orbera is a new non-surgical weight loss procedure that can help you gain the edge and lose the weight. People lost more than 3 times the weight with Orbera than diet and exercise alone. Orbera gives you that edge you need to lose the weight and power a more confident, healthier lifestyle. Orbera is not for those who are pregnant or breastfeeding, have autoimmune or organ disease. Heartburn, stomach discomfort, abdominal pain, and bowel obstruction are rare. Other adverse events include nausea and vomiting. Find out more and see if Orbera is right for you.
Has anyone ever said, you're the picture of health? You look healthy, you feel fine, but that may not be the full picture. Colorectal cancer is the second leading cancer killer of men and women over 50. doesn't always cause symptoms, but it can be prevented. Screening can find precancerous polyps so they can be removed before they turn into cancer. Get screened. Make sure you are the picture of health.
Hello and welcome back to Health Talk. I'm your host, Angela Eddy. With me is Dr. Roger Orth. He is a board-certified gastroenterologist with Gastroenterology Associates of Pensacola. Tonight we are talking about generic drugs, China, other problems, other things that could be affecting some of us or all of us, and it sounds as if it's affecting most of us. So we're talking in the first segment about generic drugs. We're going to pick up where we left off. We were talking about some of the changes that came about in 1992, which is really not that long ago when you think about it. So this is the generic drug, what was it? The Generic Drug Something Act of 1992 that you were just talking about. I forgot what the...
That's okay.
The word, but it's big. Oh,
that's
he's got
okay.
his puffin on. He's got
because I'm going to just keep plowing through this thing because there's a lot of things to cover tonight. Lots of things in this. So I'm just going to say that in 1995, the first company overseas was approved for making a generic. Now, back in the 1988, after this act, the precursor molecules could be made, and that first company was Ranbaxy. Well, Ranbaxy turns out to be a big thicket of the plot of this story. But in 1995, they were approved as the first drug. And in 2000, the very first manufacturing of a drug to come to the United States potentially was going to be, again, in Ranbaxy. So by 2005, foreign manufacturing exceeded the United States manufacturing for the drugs. Think about that. In 2005, suddenly more drugs are being made for us overseas than are being made in the country. That was a problem because the entire process of this is predicated that the FDA is approving it. The FDA is the Food and Drug Administration. It's part of the Department of Energy, part of whatever. It's a congressional thing. Now, in the United States, if you have an FDA approved drug, you are subject to an inspection anytime they show up, night or day, and the FDA inspectors are very tight. And so they would show up in the middle of the night. They would go through the trash. They would do this and that, and they could find stuff. But suddenly, it turned out that the FDA is having to go to foreign countries. Now, I want to jump backwards a bit in a moment, but I do want to mention that these initial generic drugs were being made in India. And so India was very successful at it, and a lot of that had to do with Mr. Clinton, because he had gone there and plugged the generic drugs that were being made in India that were being sent to Africa for HIV. And that was in 1990. And so when he went there in 1990, he plugged the first drug company that was in India, which was a big step forward for a primitive area like that. Then he plugged the Ranbaxy. Now, the Ranbaxy story is interesting, and one of the reasons I'm doing the talk is because we have a homegrown set of experts who interviewed someone. And so I'm going to mention that Dr. Ken Ford and Don Kernagis have a wonderful intellectual moment for those of you who are trapped not doing anything else but sitting on the dock at night or listening to a podcast called STEM Talks. And I had sent a note to Dr. Ford to see if he had a comment to me, but currently he is squirreled away in Wyoming, and he just sent me back a picture of a mountain next to him. And then I did have a nice long phone call from Don Kernagis, who's currently squirreled away in Raleigh, North Carolina, because everyone's telecommuting except for gastroenterologists who have to touch someone to actually get paid. So that leaves me with lots of time to read stuff and listen to stuff. But I listened to their STEM talk, and they interviewed a remarkable thing. And so I'm going to just allude to two different authors because that becomes part of my talk. But the first one is that Catherine Eben, and I'm going to show you this because I don't have the technology to have my slides made, but he's going to zoom in. Catherine Eben wrote a book in 2018, I believe, and it's called Bottle of Lies. Is that working out? So she's become a hot ticket because this is a really amazing book. And so I've read this book. But more importantly, I listened to Dr. Ford and Dr. Kernagis' lecture on it. I listened to it twice. I never listened to these lectures twice. I've got other things to do. So that's when I sort of solidified, you know, this might be a good subject. And then in my perusal thereafter, you know, because Dr. Ford went on to solving other problems for the military. But this book, China RX, is a remarkable book too, because this has to do with China, which is, of course, part of our story tonight. So the whole concept of how this evolves, it turns out what was a humanitarian notion that we would help people, we end up being at the whim of certain people, some of whom are very smart. In fact, most of them are very smart. And we just thought it was an important idea. So let's go back in time. Let's go back to when Mr. Clinton was the president and we had a problem called HIV. And the HIV drugs were too expensive. They were too expensive. And then we had a lot of poor people in, where? Africa. And they were getting rampaged with it. And so, for good reason, Mr. Clinton took it upon himself to decide this was a good thing to straighten out. So that's why he went to India and endorsed these companies that were sending them over there. And then it turned out, Mr. Bush. There's Mr. Bush. And in 2013, I think it was, no, it was 2004. Let's see, I'd have to look that date up. But he, in his State of the Union address, he announced that he was going to put $15 billion into a fund to pay for drugs that were going to go to Africa, not to Americans. That's a lot of money. So then we had the Republicans fighting with the Democrats about how to spend money. That's when only $1 billion was different than $1 trillion, or actually 3 or 5 trillion, or whatever we're spending this month. But back then, it's just like Everett Dirksen used to say. He was the senator from Illinois, where I grew up. And he'd say $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and after a while you're talking about real money. Well, it turned out they decided they couldn't trust the companies that were going to send it from India, so let's have the FDA inspect their plant. And that is the crux of the story tonight. The FDA was suddenly going to be inspecting it, and they were empowered to inspect the plant. And then the sudden synapse came, if it's good enough for the FDA, if they've approved it, it's going to be good enough for the American public. Well, that synapse really worked out. Because I can give you a whole litany of things, but they're in those books that I have just alluded to. I don't want to tell all the different stories that they have, but Dr. Ford's lecture was particularly good because they brought out these Peter Baker, who does these inspections, and how he became a hero inspecting first in India. And by the way, ultimately, Ranbaxy turned out to be faking their data, and the company got dissolved, basically, into Zippo later on. And some of the people from Ranbaxy went on to head up other big companies because the idea of institutional integrity is different than the idea of designing a new chemistry. But in any event, we end up having a lot of generic drugs coming from India. And back in the day, in 2009, we end up having the very first competition for those drugs. And that's coming from the elephant in the, well, actually, the panda in the room, which is the Chinese. In 2009, the Chinese get into the act of they're going to do a drug itself, and they get the FDA to approve them. That's in 2009. This doesn't seem that long ago, guys.
It is not that long ago.
It doesn't seem that long ago, but it turns out that was the nose of the camel, and I don't mean that it's a corona from the camel or a MERS. I mean, it's the Chinese. So they get their nose in the door for that. Well, at the time in 2009, that sent a shiver through the generic market because most of the generic market was being done by India because they'd already gotten this head start that Mr. Clinton helped do, and the Clinton Foundation helped fund it later, and then we got FDA approval. But what the Chinese had been doing for a long time is that they have figured out that they need to control the means of production. They need to control the actual product. They saw what, let's put it this way, they saw what happened to the Japanese in World War II. They didn't have the means of production. They didn't have it under control. And so they decided that they needed to have their series of 5-year plans. Well, this is interesting because now the stories are going to converge. So let's talk for a minute about that planning that the Chinese then have, that suddenly they're getting, that in the time frame of 2009, they were the leading source of the chemicals that make a drug. And they're also the ones who led to the ranitidine story I just told you. But ultimately, they were making the chemicals. And why? Because in China, it was okay to have pollution. In China, it was okay to have things, anything you want. And so they started making more and more things in China. Well, this is part of the asymmetric warfare that was designed as part of the entire plan of let's control the means of production. And they have a long view of the world. Don't forget, the Chinese were particularly run down in the Opium Wars in the 1830s and 1840s. And they saw how the Western people took them over. And they never forgot it. And so now today we have our Opioid Wars, which was a different TV show I did here. And I did talk about the Chinese manufacturing for that. And I'm going to come back to that if I have time at the end, because this drug industry is very prolific. But made in China has become something that they wanted to take control of it. Now in the 5-year plan that predates the current 5-year plan, the Chinese decided that they wanted to become drug powerhouses and they wanted to actually make drugs. And so then they started that plan and they had the chemical structure for their plan. And by the way, in the most current 5-year plan for China, they ended up making a completely, this seems a little bit different for me to bop over to this subject, but they had already come up that they were controlling the vitamin C in this country, the precursors for every antibiotic there is, the precursors for everything to do with penicillin, in fact, ultimately become no-brainer. We are not going to make any of that now in America. The precursors for a lot of chemistry for different chemotherapy drugs. And they had their little ups and downs with it, but in spite of everything, they plodded through it. And you know, they'd had their problems with purity. They had problems with if you don't have the right compound for your toothpaste, we'll put something that looks like it. They had people who were good chemists. They went on to do those things, but they moved into the process. Now, let's think for a minute. In 1999, Mr. Clinton, that's the same president I mentioned earlier, in 1999, he had a massive discussion about why China should be admitted to the World Trade Organization. China was admitted ultimately after his interesting set of lectures. At the time of 2000, China accounted for 1% of all things sold in the world. 1%. Now, those of you who are experiencing a current set of shortages will notice that currently in 2020, when this event occurs, it's either 37 or 39% of all things in a country in the world are coming from China. That's why when China gets sick, everybody gets sick.
And that's a good place to stop. I'm so sorry to stop you again, but
remind me to come back to the idea of personal protection,
which is very important. It's time for us to take one more break. Thank you so much for sticking with us. We'll be back in just 1 minute with more Health Talk.
It's impossible to replace anybody that you love. She was my great role model, my Grandma Keaton. It was pretty much of a shock for us when she got colon cancer. None of us were prepared for that. Here's the deal, and this is the bottom line here. Colorectal cancer is the second leading cancer killer of men and women over the age of 50. And you know what? This is one that you can prevent. Just get screened, okay? I know how precious life is right now. We can all do this. You can do it, I can do it. If I can do it, you can do it, okay? How's that for a deal?
Our weight, it's with us every day. It's not that we don't try to say goodbye to our excess weight. We do. We exercise, we eat healthier, we try to stay active. But for many of us, it's simply not enough. Well, there's finally a solution. Introducing Orbera, a non-surgical procedure to achieve meaningful long-term weight loss. Orbera is a new non-surgical weight loss procedure that can help you gain the edge and lose the weight. People lost more than 3 times the weight with Orbera than diet and exercise alone. Orbera gives you that edge you need to lose the weight and power a more confident, healthier lifestyle. Orbera is not for those who are pregnant or breastfeeding, have autoimmune or organ disease. Heartburn, stomach discomfort, abdominal pain, and bowel obstruction are rare. Other adverse events include nausea and vomiting. Find out more and see if Orbera is right for you.
Hello and welcome back to Health Talk. I'm your host, Angela Eddy. With me tonight is Dr. Roger Orth. He's a board-certified gastroenterologist with Gastroenterology Associates of Pensacola. Tonight we're talking about generic drugs, China, and other problems. We were talking right before the break about the difference in the amount that China was producing for the world, the different consumables from 1% in 2000 to almost 40%, between 30 and 40% in 2020. Consumables for the whole world, which is absolutely amazing. So, Dr. Orth, let's pick up there.
37%.
37%.
37% of, and this is for everything, all the chemicals, all the whatever, floorboard, the wallboard, or whatever it is, they made 37% in our year. But let's go over, I want to finish my concept because the fact that we don't have enough masks is actually totally linked to the drug deal that I'm talking about. So China has these 5-year plans. Remember, the Chinese are playing chess. We are playing checkers. And so they have long-term plans. They really are remarkable. It's a remarkable people. When Deng Xiaoping came and decided that, you know, I really don't think Mao had the right idea. And he said, let's get a little touch of capitalism. And he put it over there in Guangdong and says, this will be next to Hong Kong. And one thing led to another, and suddenly we gradually have a country that has lots of potential, and the government owns everything. And since the government owns everything, they can sort of control it, and they've got a different environment. That's why they can socially monitor and not bump up their corona number above 84,000, I guess. But in any event, they end up controlling the means of production, and the government's owning that. And so we have felt sorry for them because they were communists, of course, but then it turns out they're communist capitalists. And oh, that's a whole different story, it turns out, in 2020. So I want to quote Deng Xiaoping, who was the guy who started all this, who was the emperor, you know, ran not long right after Mao, that says, we will cross the river by touching each stone. And that's the kind of things they think. They think the long-term game. So as they did it on the 13th 5-year plan, which came out in 2013, they had decided that they needed to home in on potential other markets. Now, after the Ebola crisis, you guys remember Ebola? We were all fearful of the pandemic then. Must say I did a TV show on that one and I was wrong. But in any event, the personal protection gear was one of the things that they decided to home in on. N95 masks, outfits, surgical drapes, and they decided also to do infusion pumps, catheters, CT scanners, anything that you could do that was medical. And so they also then attracted the intellectual property of General Electric, who was involved with the scanners and people making ventilators. And by the way, why not throw in the screws for all surgeries and joints, angioplasty catheters, etc. And by the way, pulse oximeters are far better for means of telling if a person has corona than the thermometer. But 80% of the thermometers in the world come from China. But most of the pulse oximeters come from China also. So as we were outsourcing all this property over to China, we end up that they're in charge of all of those things over there, including personal protection. But I want to point out that this outfit comes from Norway, because I was supposed to be in Norway this year again, because it's such a great country. But the puffins have to live without me because I was going on a cruise boat. And I won't be on a cruise boat anytime soon. Barbara won't let me do that again. Anyway, we have all of these companies going over there, and you start to see this whole ripple effect, because it's not just the drugs, it's other things too. Medtronic's over there. You see articles in the Wall Street Journal that Perkins-Elmer can't get release of their machines that do the corona tests. We have, all of a sudden, we find out, boy, they've got their fingers in a lot of stuff. They actually make most of the materials for this. They make the chemicals that make this, and they make this.
And is it just because they're so much cheaper that everyone's decided to buy from them because it is so much cheaper?
You know, I will say, I admire somebody who can really figure out how to game it, because they've got it going. There's some really smart people involved with China, and they have figured out how this all works. But yes, we have outsourced the drugs because it's cheaper, and because the more the government took over healthcare, the more it had to be cheaper because the government was doing it, and so we ended up having to do that. But when we outsourced it, we did not give the support or the control to the FDA so that they could have enough visits. So they had to schedule their visits. We end up with these remarkable stories that are in those books I alluded, of people having malfeasance, that they would run gas chromatographs beforehand, they would buff the data. But if it was good enough for the FDA, it became good enough for the American consumer. And I will say, what worries me a bit is that currently that they have found a way to make a lot of money on a lot of different things, and one of them has to do with the American healthcare system. Made in China, and let me have this little question over here.
Yes, absolutely.
Somebody's called in and says, should there be some legislation to limit the number of drugs in China? Well, honestly, there should be legislation that we would have the FDA far more involved, and we would have legislation that would bring those people home who are the scientists who were outsourced. So as I talk about these different items, the different cartels that they've come up with, the pricing for vitamin C, etc., let's just talk a bit about generic drugs and how it's evolved. Because the generic drug evolution, it was cheaper initially to get something and get it away from the intellectual property of the big pharma, the ones that certain people like to pounce on. But you know what? Big pharma actually had the PhDs to do it. They had the actual scientists to do it. Before 2000, when all this started, it was extremely rare to ever have any shortages of antibiotics, chemo, anything. But nowadays, we in the endoscopy center are always finding out that we can't get enough of blank. We can't get enough of sedatives to make people sleepy. You can't get enough antibiotics. You can't get enough chemo drugs for the oncology guys because a lot of them have been outsourced to different places. They're acting basically as a cartel here. And as you look at the cartel, they had very interesting knowledge of how the United States system works with actual how the courts would rule, because they were able to show that China should be allowed to set a price, because in China it's okay to set a price, but in the United States you can't set a price, but over in China it's okay, so it's okay for their representative company to set a price. So we end up with all sorts of diminished ability to go after it. And besides, it's a black box. It's so far over there, but it's so much cheaper to go to whatever box store you like to go to for whatever it is you're doing. And if you treat drugs the same as you do cheap t-shirts and cheap shoes, you get what you pay for. And we're getting what we paid for, and which is cheaper. And it is not what I would say is the way to go. But I just want to also make a couple of other items. Between 2010 and 2013, this country had layoffs of 86,000 chemists. These are people who have advanced degrees, who always had a job. And I know at some point my MD will be outsourced over there too, and you can have them do it with WebMD, and they will speak very good English, by the way. And now that we've learned that you can actually do telecommunication, and somehow your healthcare system will think that's equivalent to somebody who's been around the block and talking to you and touching you, that's okay. So tens of thousands of jobs basically went to China and or to India, but most of them were going to China once they went. They ended up having the bigger companies, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Merck. They went over there, and they're seeing it as a potential market. Remember, basically when Clinton gave his lecture in 1999, he said that we should have them as partners in World Trade Organization because they will become able to buy our things. What they did is they played chess. They figured out how the chess game is made. They figured out how to make the board. And they didn't actually do anything except take the jobs over there. This becomes part of the bigger problem. Their 5-year plan with becoming a powerhouse is just one of the niches of their plan. They have 80,000 Western-trained PhDs that then, right after this latest plan had come out, that moved back to China because they were educated around the world. The Chinese students, if you would look at STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the stuff that made us tick after Sputnik, that what paid for my scholarships was a fear that the Russians would get ahead of us. And suddenly I could get a scholarship if I was good at science, technology, engineering, or math. And I was good at all those. So I could go to school forever. It was fun. But right now, we have a lot more students interested in iPhones than they do, because those guys are figuring out how the trace element works and how that designed the structure for it and how to do the chips. In China, there are currently 2 million STEM students yearly that have an advanced a college degree. We don't come anywhere close to that. So of course, when you have a person who's trained, you also have a person who becomes a trained worker who gradually has the ability to figure out how to do things. It worked for India, and it's doing an incredible good job in China. But I will say, in India, you have a difference because India has a sort of distillation process. And especially since I have a son-in-law who's from India, and a brilliant student, by the way. But if you have 1 billion people and only a small percentage of them come to the States, then those are the ones who are really smart and they have great skill sets. But the Chinese, they get them all over the world, and then they bring them home. And they bring them back to China, and they use that, and their use of intellectual property is totally different. Now, I don't know if you were saying I have to break.
Yes.
But
yes.
I'm going to come back to that idea.
We're going to come back to that in just 1 minute.
Oh, we're almost done.
We are almost done.
Then you can go back to sleep.
I know, but we could go on about this stuff for hours.
I could. I want to bring in Pensacola, too.
We will. We will. And we'll be back in just 1 minute with a lot more and more health talk.
Our weight, it's with us every day. It's not that we don't try to say goodbye to our excess weight. We do. We exercise, we eat healthier, we try to stay active. But for many of us, it's simply not enough. Well, there's finally a solution. Introducing Orbera, a non-surgical procedure to achieve meaningful long-term weight loss. Orbera is a new non-surgical weight loss procedure that can help you gain the edge and lose the weight. People lost more than 3 times the weight with Orbera than diet and exercise alone. Orbera gives you that edge you need to lose the weight and power a more confident, healthier lifestyle. Orbera is not for those who are pregnant or breastfeeding, have autoimmune or organ disease. Heartburn, stomach discomfort, abdominal pain, and bowel obstruction are rare. Other adverse events include nausea and vomiting. Find out more and see if Orbera is right for you.
El cine nos entretiene, pero esto no es la vida real. Lo que sí es real es que el cáncer colorectal es la segunda causa de muerte por cáncer entre hombres y mujeres. Los pólipos que lo causan pueden detectarse y eliminarse antes de que se convierten en cáncer. Pero tú lo puedes prevenir. Hágase un examen para detectar el cáncer colorectal. Yo lo hice. Podría salvar su vida.
Si usted es mayor de 50 años, hágase el examen de detección.
Hello and welcome back to Health Talk. I'm your host, Angela Eddy. With me is Dr. Roger Orth. He's a board-certified gastroenterologist with Gastroenterology Associates of Pensacola. And tonight we're talking about generic drugs in China and lots of other problems, different things that are going on in the world today and the history kind of leading up to where we are today. And before the break, we were talking about jobs, things like that. Dr. Orth, you want to pick up where we were?
Yeah, I don't want to get too much into it, but my daughter works for a large pharmaceutical company, and they're very cautious about what they do in China because some of the larger pharmaceutical companies have had their intellectual property moved. So they actually, reverse engineering is a pretty interesting subject. And so I'm going to kind of spend just a few minutes talking about why they're nervous about making things over there, because they do tend to find a way to take the technology, whether it's making a car or a chip or a drug. And so her particular large company does make some things there, but they don't make the higher tech, newer, brand new things because it won't last. Now, some of our big corporations, including the biggest ones like Pfizer, have been burned over there. They've been burned, and Baxter was burned over there. So I might just end up telling you just a few brief stories. One is an interesting story that has to do with heparin. Let's do that one. So it turned out in China, there was a problem, and the heparin that normally comes from pigs, it's a biologic project, and they had a zoonosis over there. Have you ever heard of zoonosis? We're having one right now, except it's in humans. But they had this blue tip problem with their cow or the pigs over there. So they ran out of solid pigs from their usual source. So they were getting pigs from a different set of vats, and they ended up with highly sulfated chondroitin sulfate, which is an integral part of the distillation process. And we ended up having some of that sent into this country, and people got very sick from it, and Baxter was part of that deal. And so Baxter had to back off, and ultimately now the company that had started out, and by the way, Goldman Sachs was behind the funding for that company, and Goldman Sachs, when that company went public, took their $5 million investment and got $1 billion out of it. So just the fact that our financial structure is also woven in. Somebody's making a buck on it, and sometimes it's some of our fellow Americans. And if you were interested in a very interesting book, it's Henry Paulson's Dealing with China. But he talks about how he made deals there, but we're feeling the deals that he had. But anyway, little Robin was spent time in China as part of her advanced studies for MBA, and so she got me to read the book that they recommended over there, and lo and behold, there's a guy who ran Goldman Sachs. But if you look and see where did that money come from that funded these different companies. So I know I'm running sort of out of time, but I'm not out of things to say.
I know. We have
But
a lot.
I did want to bring up a local story.
Yes, you said we had a
because
Pensacola connection.
It's a Pensacola connection. And so I called my buddy today, but he's not available because he's probably in hiding because he's immunocompromised. But I thought it would be interesting to make a point of discussing another drug that had a series of recalls in July of 2018. And that would be Diovan or valsartan. Now, in 2018, it turns out it's a problem because the system that was making it, and it's from a company called Zhejiang Huawei, it's a pharmaceutical house, they had taken over how to make this drug. This had been one of the world's largest selling blood pressure related drugs. And they also figured out a way to do it cheaper. And when they did it cheaper, they ended up making it, they were doing the precursors, and then they published how to do it, since a generic drug could publish it. But then everybody who was a generic maker around the world, they would buy the chemical precursors from them. Because for API, which is the approved pharmacological ingredients, the leading place for a decade and a half, is China. So they're the ones selling it. Well, this is a problem because they ended up having another one of those nitrosamines, and this time it's a nitrosodimethylamine. But because of the way they made it, it ends up being at a very toxic dose. And it was contaminating the valsartan, and it would have particularly high, instead of microgram amounts, which is approved by the FDA, it was milligram amounts. I thought this interesting, that some of the pills, when they measured it, that the pills were equivalent to eating 48 pounds of bacon. Well, I like bacon.
48 pounds is a lot.
But the nitrosamines in bacon is actually a cause of cancer. So it turns out it's an active pharmaceutical ingredient that was being dispersed to all the generics making Diovan all over the world. And so you ended up having this tendency to make a cancer. And so, again, it's a GI problem because the cancer that it makes is a primary liver cancer. Well, so what goes around coming around, we've got, you know, the first TV show I ever did in Pensacola in 1984, I was a guest of a guy named Fred Levin because they couldn't find any other doctor who would talk to him. Now, I tried to call Fred today, but the guy who's leading the pack for this plaintiff suit against that particular company, which has now had to take the drug off the market, is actually Levin Group. It's one of the lawyers in their group. Just like Papantonio, they do these big class action suits. That's how they have big boats and things, but they're good at it. But rarely can you actually sue somebody in China, but they're actually working on suing China. And I would have to say more power to you, Fred. See if you can bring them down and bring your guys down. So that suit is being led through Pensacola. How interesting is that? But anyway, the company had what they, on the GC mass specs, they would have what's called a ghost peak because it was contaminated material. But those of us who have ever done chromatography know that a spec is actually something. And so they called them ghost peaks, but then they would rerun it and then they would change it around a little bit. But then ultimately, one of the big companies, Novartis, is going to buy the materials for the drug so that they can sell it. They bought 45 tons of it. And they found out that the ghost peak was NDMA, the cancer agent. Well, how did they find out? They tested it. They tested it themselves. And so even though the company that's selling it in China is an API, an approved pharmaceutical ingredient, but it's not being inspected. No one at the FDA is measuring what's in the drugs. Which then brings me towards the end. Where are we going? Because we are at the end. But I will say, I'm going to plug something that also was plugged in the STEM talk. And I will say thanks again to Ken and Dawn, because there's a pharmacy that's called Valisure, V-A-L-I-S-U-R-E. Look them up. This is very interesting. How do we protect ourselves? With Valisure, You can send your chemical, your drug, your generic drug to them, and they will measure it. And they'll tell you what toxin's in it. But they sell generic drugs. So in the end, what's going to happen is that we'll have more and more companies that are testing the chemicals that are coming from overseas. And really, but my real plea here today is, let's bring it home. In the 50s with Sputnik, we were afraid. Well, Sputnik was nothing compared to COVID. And COVID's a serious situation, but we need to bring it home. We need to have people back in America taking care of Americans. We need to fix this. We need to do it together. And this is what is really working me into a tizzy over this. I lose sleep at night because I'm actually part of a pandemic. You know, when I was talking to people in January about this problem, I remember learning about the 1917-18 influenza pandemic. And they said, it will never happen. It could happen. And you know what? It did happen.
It is happening.
It's just unbelievable.
It is.
But it's time to let Americans use the intellectual property that's there, spend some money not just supporting, you know, more respirators, spend some money on some science, and let's bring it home.
And that's a great way to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'd rather play chess any day than checkers.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Strange times we're living in. Got you some good science this time. Check out the books that Dr. Orth had recommended. And please come back and we'll talk more with you next month when we come back for more health talk.
I've got to go back to quarantine. Thanks, Angela, for coming out.
Thank you.